So our next presenter is Professor Stephen Resnicoff, who's a professor of law and co-director of the Center for Jewish Law and Judaic Studies at DePaul University College of Law. So Steve wears at least a couple of hats you can see. The one that he always wears, and then there's and there's also the law hat. So this gentleman is widely respected and widely published authority both in law and areas such as dispute resolution, commercial paper, legal ethics, bankruptcy, and also an authority on the Talmud, and he manages to apparently write and teach on those sometimes separately and sometimes together. So please welcome Professor Resnicoff.
Okay, first I wanted to thank our hosts, both University of Maryland generally and the Smith School specifically, and I really want to thank the members of the committee, all the members of the committee, because I didn't realize what kind of honor I had when they invited me to participate. Now that I've heard so many wonderful presentations, I now even cherish the opportunity more than I did before. And of course, Dr. Kaufman, we know that the Torah says without the wheat, there's no learning. And so the person who supports the enterprise is extraordinarily important. Okay, the conference call for papers posed two questions. I focused on the second, which was, how and why have business and financial actors seriously compromised the leading religious traditions of their cultures? It presupposed that they did, and asked how and why. So I understood the question as being motivated by the ostensibly growing phenomenon of active misconduct by business actors, rather than by their mere reluctance to undertake unrelated, socially responsible initiatives. And I think that we really could, as a conference, have divided the two and dealt with them somewhat differently, despite the slight overlaps. So I'm going to focus on that second. I'm not going to talk about what Jewish law prescribes in terms of moral rules. I think Susan talked about it a little bit. We all know a little bit about it. My feeling is that while there's considerable debate among us with respect to what is better or best in terms of socially responsible activities, I believe that there's considerable consensus as to what's bad. In other words, I think we all know that fraud is bad, breach of fiduciary duty is bad, Ponzi schemes as fraud is bad, stealing is bad. We all know that, and yet those are the things that have happened in those scandals that got more attention than the others. So what I want to do is look at the religious traditions, not look at the narratives, as Bruce might say, not for the rules, but for for an explanation of why we have the misconduct, and for suggestions as to how we can ameliorate the problem. In other words, learn from the traditions in a way that everybody can without buying into the rulings of a particular religion. But I do want to mention one other thing which is important to me. And I think it'll be important to George, who didn't give me his last name, but George, we had a conversation, and it's the following. There is an expression in American law, we say going beyond the letter of the law. There is an expression in Jewish law, lifnim mishurat hadin, that is customarily translated as beyond the letter of the law. But it's not correct, in my opinion. Lifnim means within, not beyond. Shurat is the line, and there's the fundamental difference between Jewish perspective and the secular perspective is evidenced by this distinction. In other words, secular law assumes that a person, a human being, is a beast, owes no duties to anybody else, has no moral culture, no moral character, and the law requires him to do something, takes him out of that wildness, and requires him to do something. And if he goes beyond what the law requires, it's even better. Judaism believes that each person is made in God's image, holy. Think of a circle. The center of the circle is the soul, the holy soul. Now, you're living in the world, and there are practical problems, there are distractions, and sometimes you can stray from that core. But the law is the circumference of the circle telling you can't go beyond that. You got to stay close to home, where your holy center is. And the closer you are, lifnim mishirat hadin, closer to that center, the better off you are, the better person you are, the holier person you are. So that's a difference, fundamental difference between the way secular society looks at the human being has to be tamed, and the way Jewish religion looks at people as being holy. Okay, I have a bunch of caveats on the screen. I'm not going to read them to save time, but you can read them while I'm talking. The first one, though, does tell you where you can download my article, at least the current draft of the article, and see it in complete glory, and you see the citations and so on. There's just too much to talk about in just a short period of time. I firmly believe that by eschewing unethical practices, individuals and entities can realize significant benefits, surely emotional, spiritual, psychological benefits, and quite possibly pecuniary benefits. And after all, there are those studies that say that a lot of countries where the income isn't very much, their happiness is very high. So there's a great deal to be said for trying to be good. Nevertheless, my purposes are limited. I'm not going to try to prove the case that it's good to be good. But what I'm trying to do is talk about how, if you are a company or you are an individual, you are a company and you know what rules you want to abide by. You know what ethical rules you want to abide by. Or if you're a human being and you've spent the time, it's a good investment, to figure out what your religious principles are. So the question is how to go about making sure that your company and your employees abide by them and that you yourself abide by them. I don't expect you to take notes. That's why I'm running through this. But I'm going to do the following. I have a completely different organization from I have in my paper, and I have a completely different organization from what I had for the rest of my slides, so I'm not showing you the rest of my slides, because I figured out, I finally came to me that there's no time. So what I'm going to do is tell you a Jewish law principle, teaching. I'm going to tell you some of the practical implications for that teaching, and then I'm going to explain the sources for that teaching, and where applicable, I'm going to mention some behavioral economic studies which come to the same conclusion as the Jewish tradition. First, unethical actions are often caused by success rather than by adversity. Practical lesson, organizations should realize, among other things, that they should require important decisions to be made collaboratively, and that they should have independent mechanisms for monitoring the ethical conduct of those who wield power. Organizations must monitor their leaders, including and perhaps especially the successful ones, because successful people often think that they're entitled to more than others, that the reasons for the normal rules don't apply to them anyway. Financial success can lead to increased greed. Power over others can present a great temptation for abuse. And finally, even if successful people realize they have erred, their pride makes them unlikely to disclose that and to correct their mistakes. Explanation of this is from the Jewish tradition. It's often supposed that unethical actions are the product of extreme adversity, which as a practical matter leaves a person no ethical alternative. However, while adversity certainly can result in unethical decisions, as discussed later on, success is also a common cause. Focusing on the biblical teaching regarding King David's involvement with Bathsheba, Ludwig and Longnecker describe the phenomenon as the Bathsheba syndrome. Judaism teaches that when a person experiences success, he becomes inflated with his sense of self-importance. Because of his accomplishments and the significance of his work, he thinks he deserves more than others. After all, everyone else depends on his performing at his best. In order to do so, he reasons he needs some special benefits or luxuries. The rules that apply to others don't apply to him. The Talmud teaches the greater the man, the greater his evil inclination, the temptation to do wrong. In other words, power corrupts. For this reason, the Torah includes a number of specific obligations that are particularly and solely incumbent on a king. He whom you appoint as a king shall not have too many wives, so that his heart not turn astray, and he shall not greatly increase silver and gold for himself. It shall be that when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself 2 copies of this Torah in a book. 1 copy shall be with him. He takes it with him everywhere he goes. And he shall read from it all the days of his life, so that he will learn to fear God, to observe all the words of this Torah and these decrees, to perform them, so that his heart does not become haughty over his brethren and not turn from the commandment right or left. A successful person's conceit can also extend to a bloated belief in his ethical superiority. According to the Jewish tradition, King David's son, King Solomon, was the wisest man ever to have lived. Nevertheless, he was ensnared by his own vanity. The Talmud explains that the maximum number of wives permitted to a king, I cited before the fact that you can't have too many wives, a king can't, was 18. Nevertheless, a lot of mothers-in-law. Nevertheless, the Midrash says that Solomon engaged in the following rationalization. Why did God command that a king should not have too many wives? Is it not because the Torah is concerned that they might cause his heart to go astray? After all, this is one of the few times when the Torah explicitly states the reason for a command. For me, however, this will not be a problem. I can marry many wives without being affected. I can handle it. As a result, Solomon married 700 wives and kept 300 concubines. Tradition says that Solomon entered into these marriages with the good intention of establishing politically advantageous alliances with the numerous city-states and nations from which these wives hailed. He may also have wanted to influence these peoples towards adopting Judaism. Nevertheless, the results were tragic. Many of these wives themselves continued their own people's idolatrous practices. Indeed, Scripture says, in his old age, his wives turned away Solomon's heart after other gods. Makes it sound as though he committed idolatry. Traditional sources explain that this is an overstatement and that Solomon never engaged in idolatry. However, because he was the king and he failed to prevent his own wives from these transgressions, it is as if he were personally guilty. The emphasis on collaborative decision-making is also evident with respect to Jewish judicial proceedings, which typically require panels of at least 3 judges. As the Mishnah says, nobody judges alone except God. There are numerous detailed Jewish law rules to ensure that courtroom judges are not biased. Consequently, if consultation is demanded of these impartial judges, it's all the more necessary when there is a greater chance that a particular decision maker, such as a colleague or supervisor in the workplace, might be partial. Furthermore, the Jewish governmental structure is based on a system of institutional cooperation, checks, and balances. The 3 principal institutions are the kingship, the high priesthood, and the great council, and the power of each one of these is limited. When success involves financial prosperity, such success also increases greed. Judaism teaches that as one enjoys financial prosperity, one gets greedier. In the commentary to the book of Ecclesiastes, the sages teach that if a person has 100, he wants 200. If he has 200, he wants 400. And interestingly, a series of 7 studies performed by psychologists at the University of California at Berkeley and the University of Toronto, quote, found that upper-class participants were more likely to lie and cheat when gambling or negotiating, cut people off when driving, and endorse unethical behavior in the workplace, unquote. The lead author of the paper covering these studies and published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences stated, the increased unethical tendencies of upper-class individuals are driven in part by their more favorable attitudes toward greed. Finally, success, ego inflation, and public recognition make it more difficult for a person to admit that he has made a mistake or exercise misjudgment. As a result, these characteristics can lead to cover-ups, which can even be more unethical and more harmful than the action being covered up. Lesson 2, bias and preconceptions lead to unjust decisions. Practical lessons. 1, an organization should not have complaint or dispute resolution procedures that allow ex parte proceedings, i.e., proceedings that allow one of the disputants to present its case to an adjudicator in the absence of the other disputant, even if later on the other disputant is given a chance to be heard. 2, they should have strict conflicts of interest rules. No matter how a person is well-intended, no matter how much a person is well-intended, the person is likely not to realize how much he or she is biased by a conflict of interest. 3, the organization should articulate and communicate its ethical rules as clearly as possible. An ethics code, for example, should have at least some clarifying illustrations, including, of course, the threshold criteria that trigger the need to initiate any internal ethics evaluation procedure. 4, the organization should immunize employees from retaliation for initiating any internal ethics evaluation procedure. The basis of this is Jewish tradition. According to Jewish law, a judge is forbidden to listen to the arguments of either party to a dispute unless the other party is present. This is true even if the entire original conversation was taped and the other party is permitted to respond to each and every argument. Why? If both parties are present and the first party's contentions are immediately challenged by the second party, the judge is not prejudiced in either direction. However, If only one party is initially present and elaborates his arguments without challenge, these arguments can make a firm impression in the judge's mind. Once that impression takes root, it is unduly difficult to deracinate it. Example of this is in the second volume of Samuel. Ziva slandered Mephibosheth to King David. The Talmud reports that according to Rav, King David wrongfully and immediately treated this unsubstantiated slander as true and declared Mephibosheth's properties forfeit and transferred to Ziva. Later, when King David actually encountered Mephibosheth and heard his denial of the slander and knew that it wasn't true, so King David stated, I hereby declare that you and Ziva should split the property. So according to Rav in the Talmud, Mephibosheth's denial should have been more than sufficient for David to have returned all the property to him. But once David had accepted the false report, it was too difficult for him to extirpate it from his mind completely. It still had an impression. Behavioral economic studies have confirmed that even minor gratuities clearly bias a person's perceptions. One study was done by Harvey, Kirk, Denfield, and Montague at the Bayless College of Medicine. Subjects were told that they would be evaluating art from the Third Moon Gallery and the Lone Wolf Gallery, two different galleries. Some of the subjects were told that their payment for participating was donated by Third Moon, and others were told that their payment came from Lone Wolf. Each subject was then asked to remain as still as possible in a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner. While there, they saw a consecutive series of 60 paintings from the 13th through the 20th centuries. The paintings ranged from representational to abstract art. Near the top left corner of each painting was the attractive logo of one of the galleries. Some of the paintings were from the gallery that, according to the information the subjects were told, had sponsored that subject, while the other paintings were from the other gallery. After all 60 of the paintings were scanned, the subjects were asked to look at the paintings with the logos again and rate them on a scale ranging from dislike to like. The study showed that the subjects preferred the paintings that came from the galleries that supposedly had sponsored them. Moreover, the brain scans showed the same effect. The fMRI showed that the presence of the sponsoring gallery's logo increased the activity of that part of the subject's brains related to pleasure. This seemed to indicate that the favor from the sponsoring gallery had a deep effect on how the subjects responded to the art. Interesting, when they asked whether they thought that the sponsor's logo affected their prejudices in any way, they said no. They don't realize how much. You have to have rules, not rely on people saying it doesn't affect me, I'm not biased. Furthermore, the amount paid to the subjects by their sponsoring galleries ranged from $30 to $300. Not a whole lot of money, right? The results of the study showed that as the amount got higher, the amount of the favoritism got higher. Similarly, by the way, Jewish tradition teaches that when someone's own interests are at stake, that self-interest causes a person to interpret every ambiguity in his own favor. Grasp at straws to come to see something in his favor. For example, in Exodus, after the Jewish people entered the desert, God tells Moses to have the people turn back and camp. He tells Moses, Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they're locked in the land, the wilderness has locked them up, and we can go get them. The Jewish commentators are astonished by this. I mean, how could Pharaoh possibly think that after all the miracles the Almighty did for the Israelites to save them from the Egyptians, and now when they were finally liberated, he finally liberated them, he would forsake them? Anyone with any level of intelligence whatsoever would realize that it would be impossible for the Egyptians to harm the Jews at that point. Yet, similarly, we have a lot of examples where someone's bias makes him oblivious to reality. I can give you a number of examples, but paper does. I'll give you one. Balaam. Balaam was hired to curse the Jews, right? And there's a whole question of him going out, and he shouldn't go out. But when he finally goes out, his ass speaks to him, complains that he's beating him for no reason, right? What does Balaam do? Wow, this is amazing. The ass talks. No, doesn't bother him at all. He says, well, I would have killed you. He's oblivious. His desire to go out and make money for cursing the Jews is overwhelming. He's just oblivious to reality. He's the same thing, for example, in the story of Sodom, where Lot is out with the two angels, and the people of the town come say, give us these visitors and we will know them, and it says that the angels made them blind. And what does the text tell you? They still were trying to get a hold of Lot. Suddenly they're blind. You would think that it would stop, right? No, they're oblivious. It's an amazing thing. Teaching 3, Jewish routine dulls one's ethical sensitivity. Practical lessons. 1, although it's critical for an organization to communicate its ethical rules to its constituents, it is equally important to continue to remind those constituents of these rules, of the intrinsic importance of the rules, and of the importance that the organization places on the rules. 2, these communications should be accomplished through a variety of media. 3, the communication should also be accomplished through the organization's conduct, such as by using its resources to train its employees regarding the rules, to reward those who uphold the rules, to discipline those who don't. 4, the organization should maintain an ongoing dialogue among its agents and employees regarding the organization's values and rules, not only to provide reminder and to underscore the importance of the rules, but also to determine whether evolving business practices raise new scenarios that need to be so addressed. 5, when an employee engages in certain transactions or makes particular types of decisions, it may be helpful for the organization to require the employee, this is what David alluded to earlier, to sign a document that contains in it a specific reference to the organization's ethics rules or a statement that any applicable ethical rules have been fulfilled. In fact, it'd be good to have the employee specifically initial that provision in the agreement. This is suggested by Professor Ariely from Duke. To explain this teaching, Jewish law teaches that one can become insensitive to important ethical considerations by being distracted by one's routine. Let me mention a Talmudic passage. When Jacob was sent away to get married, his mother said, "Why should I see both of my sons die in the same day?" Esav and Jacob. Turns out the Talmud says that they were both buried on the same day. What happened? The brothers were taking Jacob out to bury in the cave of Machpelah, and along came Esav. And Esav said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, we're burying our father in the cave." He said, "No, he used that for his wife. That's his wife's. It's not that he used up his place." And they said, "What do you mean he used you? But he bought your place." He said, "What do you mean you bought your place? Prove it." He said, "We have a deed from you." He says, "Where is it?" "Well, it's back in Egypt." "Well, go get it." So as this is going on, Hushim ben Dan, one of Jacob's grandsons, who was hard of hearing, he's watching this, and he says, "What's going on?" And somebody starts to explain to him, and he says, "Wait a minute, my grandfather is here, being embarrassed. I mean, he's supposed to be buried, and we're waiting while this evil person is making arguments." And he hit him over the head, and it says that the head rolled down, and the head went into the cave. What's the explanation? The commentators explain that everybody else, somebody made an argument, they had an answer. Someone made an argument, they had an answer. Suddenly they're lost in the trees. They forget what's going on here. But the one who was deaf didn't hear. He wasn't lulled to sleep by this. And he acted. By the way, it's an interesting thing. As an aside, it says that Esav's head, doesn't say they took his head out of the cave. Why? His head, Esav was a smart guy. He knew about doing commandments. Only problem was he was what we call a Baal Taiva. He was someone who wanted to do other things. He was led astray. His head belonged there. His body didn't. So his head was buried there. By the way, there's an experiment by Bateson, Nettle, and Roberts conducted at the University of Newcastle, established, let me tell you, let's start with this one. Social science studies have all showed that ethical reminders can promote ethical behavior. One study involved 229 students who were split into various groups. One group was asked to try to recall as many of the 10 commandments as they could. Then they were given the opportunity to cheat on a particular laboratory test. The other group was asked to remember any 10 books they read in high school. Those were days when people read books in high school. Before being given the same chance to cheat on a laboratory test. So it didn't matter whether the people who remembered part of the 10 Commandments remembered one of them or two of them or many of them. It didn't matter how many they remembered. The mere fact they were reminded of them, they didn't cheat as much as the other people cheated. So just this reminder. So Jewish literature repeatedly emphasizes the need to remember that we're constantly being watched by the one who sees all. Consider three things and you will not come into the grip of sin, says the Mishnah. Know what is above you, a watchful eye, an attentive ear, and all your deeds are recorded in a book. And an experiment by, this is now the experiment by Bates and Netto and Roberts at the University of Newcastle, said the mere feeling of being watched could deter bad behavior. The experiment took place in the kitchen of the university's psychology department. Tea, coffee, and milk were available for faculty and students. Above the area for making tea, there was a sign stating that those who drank beverages should contribute some money to the nearby honesty box. During the experiment, which lasted 10 weeks, the sign was decorated with images. The type of images alternated each week. On 5 weeks, the sign was decorated with images of flowers. On the other 5 weeks, it was decorated with images of eyes. The researchers found that at the end of every week, there was some money in the box, but at the end of weeks where the decorations were the eyes, there was almost 3 times as much money as when there was flowers. Because when you're watched, remember you're watched, so you have to have constant reminders. Teaching number 4, a person's ethical conduct is largely a product of what the person does. Practical lessons, try to ensure that the organization's ethical rules are consistent with the ethical rules a person should be expected to fulfill outside the workplace. Try to dispel the notion of schizophrenic, role-differentiated morality. In my paper, I made this a very, very extensive discussion, but we don't have time to go through it. But the idea is, you want to say, why is it that sometimes people do one thing in their church or their synagogue, and they do a different thing in business? They cheat people in business. Well, the truth is, they actually more likely cheat people everywhere now. Because you are, Jewish tradition says you are nifal l'fi tu'al tov. Your ethical character is shaped by what you do, your actions. And there's many explanations of this, many different explanations of this in Jewish tradition. And what happens today, it's almost, if you're Orthodox Jew, you're 24/6. But if you're not religious at all, you're 24/7 what you have. So if you have a hat, a professional hat, like if you're an attorney, an accountant, whatever you are, you're almost always doing that. And if those ethical rules are not the rules we want, and they usually aren't, I can speak from the legal profession, usually not, then you're being trained to do the wrong things. And we've got to try to make sure that those rules are not the wrong things. But you also have to watch what you're doing and be aware of it. And you have to monitor the ethical, and second thing is you have to monitor the ethical conduct of those in the organization who make decisions that may adversely affect someone's rights. Here's a very interesting passage in the Torah. It says there's a phenomenon that the Talmud says never happened. One view is that it did happen, but Talmud says it didn't ever happen. But as a ruling, it says that if the majority of the people in the town commit idolatry, everybody's put to death. So the majority of the people in the town, now it didn't happen because there's a lot of legal restrictions, but the idea that the majority of the people, they have to be put to death. And then immediately thereafter, God says that he promises us mercy. And the question is, what's the juxtaposition of these two? And the commentator, one of the 18th century commentators, explains that even when what you're doing is a commandment of God, if the nature of the act is cruel, then doing it can affect your soul. And so when God orders us to do this mitzvah, this commandment, he promises that won't happen. He makes a special promise that won't happen. He's going to give us a blessing that if we do this, it won't affect our moral character. I will skip a lot. 5. Oh, no, I have to tell you this. The secular support for this concept of that you're formed by what you do. Hamlet urging his mother not to go to his uncle's bed, because if she doesn't go once, maybe she won't go a second time. Fessinger's theory of cognitive dissonance. I know people are sure of Fessinger's theory of cognitive dissonance, but for example, it says that it was an explanation for forced busing. Like it or not, it was an explanation for forced busing to integrate schools. What was the explanation? It said if you're forced to do something that you don't want to do, that you think is wrong, you don't want to do something that you think is wrong. But if you're forced to do it, so then it builds up dissonance. It's very upsetting to you, very emotionally upsetting to you. But if you can't do anything but obey, what can you do? Change your opinion, change your mind. So he says that you change. That's why, for example, at a nuclear energy facility, we require external monitors, not the people on site only. Why? Because the people on site did such fear that if they had to realize how dangerous it was every day, they couldn't do it. So they develop a callus, and they become insensitive to the risk. So we need to have someone external do the monitoring. So you are a product of what you do. So Gino, Norton, and Reale did an experiment regarding self-signaling. To see what happened. He said the people use knockoff purses. I'm not sure if it was purses or some other kind of article. But he gave some people the real thing, but he told them they were knockoffs, kind of counterfeit. And he gave the other people the real thing, told them the real thing. And the people who used what they were told was counterfeit, and the next thing they were supposed to do, they cheated more. Because they saw them, it was signaling to themselves that they already weren't so great. And this was people who didn't go out and buy the things themselves even. It's not like they bought them, they would just hand them. It's very interesting. So he said, Ariely's conclusion was that by knowingly putting on a counterfeit product, it loosens one's moral constraints, making it easier for one to take further steps down the path of dishonesty. The fifth teaching is that unethical conduct is infectious. You are not only influenced by what you do, you are interested in what people around you are doing, right? For example, we say, Jewish tradition says that the time of the flood, not only were people being morally corrupt, but the people's being morally corrupt actually affected the animal kingdom and the earth itself. What do I mean? It says that, well, I guess I took it out because I thought it was too long. So anyhow, but it's in the article. And he points out that Ariely has a book, and he points out that it was an April 2011 show, This American Life, included a story about a young college student who was promoted to manager of the gift shops of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in D.C. All of the employees were volunteers, mostly retirees. The shop sold over $400,000 of merchandise each year. But of the 400,000, 150,000 of it disappeared. More than a third. The manager suspected a particular employee and arranged a sting operation, which involved marked funds. When police checked the subject, they found that he had misappropriated some of the funds, $60. But even after they fired this guy, the money and merchandise kept disappearing. As Ariely concludes, the problem was not a single thief, but the multitude of elderly, well-meaning, art-loving volunteers would help themselves to the goods and lose cash. It was an ambience where no one paid attention. You know? So it's very important to make sure that you, sort of like the broken windows theory, I don't know if people familiar with the broken windows theory, that you have to make sure that you don't allow even relatively small or trivial wrongs. You can go ahead and tell people, it's okay, we allow you to take pencils home, we allow you to take pens home, we allow you to do this and that, then they're not doing something that's wrong. But if you tell them they can't, and they do it, they steal little things from the office, and you don't stop them, you don't respond to it, it creates a culture in which everybody thinks it's okay. And you see, the cumulative effect can be quite great, but the moral effect of each person can be equally great. Not just the dollars and cents, but the morals. So you can have rules. Be generous with your employees, but make the rules specific. And when they're violated, don't ignore the violations. I guess I have to stop. I have more principles I wanted to mention. Let me just mention one more, I guess. One must prepare for foreseeable adversities. Practical lessons. An organization's ethics structure should provide for an ongoing and interactive process for determining the appropriate ethical responses to these various scenarios. This will minimize the likelihood that people will be completely unprepared when a foreseeable issue arises. And an organization's ethics structure should provide psychological consultants and therapists for those who are experiencing spiritual and ethical adversity, when they are especially vulnerable to slipping. Its policies might provide for increased ethical monitoring of these kind of employees. Why? Well, because there are times where someone gets pushed off balance. And they get pushed off balance and they fall. And they can fall a long way. You see that Cain, the eldest son of the first human being, he was the one who created the concept of offering a sacrifice to God. Not his being at that level when his sacrifice wasn't accepted and his brother's was, that was a shove. He wasn't ready. His response was catastrophic. And we have a number of other kinds of examples. For example, the book of Ruth. Ruth had a sister-in-law, right? And the sister-in-law didn't go with Naomi back to the Jewish people. She gave up, and she went back to her own people. The Jewish tradition, Jewish literature says that she was at a high level. She almost went with Naomi, but she didn't. And it says by the end of the day, which this is, I'm not saying literally, I'm not presenting as a literalist approach, but it says that by the end of the day, she had engaged in all sorts of terrible, because she went the wrong direction, slipped, and plummeted. You had to be ready. In a legal issue, I'll give you a case with me, and I'll stop with this. That is, for example, I tell students, when I teach legal ethics, I say, listen, you have to try to anticipate the kinds of problems that will frequently arise. You've got to try to and figure out how you want to respond, because there's no way that you're going to get the best answer by waiting for it to happen and on the spot try to do something, right? When your boss comes in and introduces a client to you and tells you, Bob here is our expert in bankruptcy law. Bob doesn't know anything about bankruptcy law. Right? Now, if it's not easy for Bob to say something, right, but if he doesn't say something, it's going to become exponentially harder to say an hour from then, 2 hours from then. Right? And it really could cause a tremendous loss. If he really doesn't know about it, I teach bankruptcy law. I can tell you there are very small windows of opportunity. You can easily miss and cause your client great loss, and afterwards cause you great loss. Similarly, what about signing an affidavit, notarizing something? Now, in New Jersey, where I practice most, every attorney can notarize something. But other places, some people do, some people don't. Someone comes to you, and they're definitely going to ask you, can you notarize this? Sure, where's the person who's going to sign it in front of me? Well, the person's not, is home, she's old, she's sick, she can't come in. You know, listen, she's on there already. You know me, I'm your client for 20 years, right? And it's your boss, the partner, is going to tell you, take care of it. Take care of it. It's an important client. Now, aside from the fact that it's dishonest to do that. You're lying if you but not only that, it's actually dangerous. You don't know. The person who signed it may have signed it, may be dead now. The person who supposedly signed it may not have signed it. It might have been, this guy is going to run off with Lola, and he wanted the money from the bank, and had the bank, had his wife who's poor invalid, if it didn't sign it, he forged your name. You don't know. You have to be, this is a common scenario, many common kinds of scenarios in each profession, I'm sure each business, you can identify them. And what's important is to prepare in advance. So back to what I tried to say before, I think I'm not dealing with what are the right rules, but I think what we should teach people in our ethics courses is not just what the rules are, what the union rules are, but we should teach them, once you know what rules you have, how should we go about making sure, how you should go about making sure that your employees follow them and that you follow them. And for that, we should look at social psychology, because all sorts of things have changed over time. The only thing that, all sorts of technology has changed. But what hasn't changed is the human character. It hasn't really changed. And we have to, at some point, we have to figure out how to control it, how to solve our problem.
Bob Nelson, I'm from the School of Public Policy here at the University of Maryland. Sounded very familiar in terms of what went on in Wall Street. And you were basically giving a catalog of from the Old Testament of behavioral patterns which were replicated, in the past decade. And so anyway, I was just sitting here thinking, this sounds like a frivolous idea, but you didn't say very much about punishment. And a lot of the Old Testament is about punishment. And for doing these kinds of things that you're talking about and breaking God's rules and so forth. So, and usually, the punishment can take a lot of forms. An environmental catastrophe is a common one, but it can be human as well. So, you know, if you were a biblical believer or scholar, could you believe that the financial crisis was God's signal to, you know, I mean, would that be a logical way to think about it in a biblical framework?
Well, okay, so you began by talking about punishment, and so I would, to that part, I just respond by saying, I'm not here trying to tell you what rules to apply. Once you have ethical rules, you can decide what punishments to apply. You know, you don't have to, I'm not saying you should look at this book or this tradition or that tradition as to how to punish for your penal theory. But it does give you lessons as to human behavior. And that's what we want to control. We'd rather not have the bad behavior rather than worry about how to punish it. In terms of whether
I would say
Jewish
God
tradition,
does the punishment.
Well,
humans don't decide what the punishment is. God decides when it's appropriate and then executes it.
that's not the Jewish tradition.
No?
No. The Jewish tradition is that, for example, in Judaism, we believe that there's laws for Jews and there's laws for all of the descendants of Noah. So everybody else, there's laws for Jews. And one of the laws for everybody else is a law that we have as well. That is that you have to have justice system. That everybody is obligated to have a system of justice, and to mete out justice, to have rules and to have punishments. And that you are authorized, and not just authorized, you're actually, from a Jewish perspective, every society is required to do it. And actually, the failure to do it explains certain of the biblical incidents of certain people punished because the community didn't have laws and didn't enforce laws and allowed lawlessness to go on. But I'm just saying that it's not for me to tell a group like this, you know, what I think ought to be the punishments, what should be the procedures. But the idea that should you look at what happens and try to see whether it's a message from God or not. So this is an area of great debate among theologians. But what you should do is you should look for a lesson to improve yourself, not look for a lesson to see how somebody else was supposed to be punished. If something happens, God forbid, to you, then you should look within yourself to see if you can improve yourself, because perhaps it was a punishment to you. But you're not in a position to tell whether something happened to somebody else is a punishment to them. That's the Jewish perspective.
Hi, Ron Colombo again. I asked this question because it comes up in some of my own work and my own thinking, so I'd appreciate your response to it. So you went through the Bible, the Old Testament, and you came up with a lot of examples of human behavior and good rules that are applicable to business. I mean, that's how I understood most of your presentation, saying that these are good examples to follow, these are good suggestions. However, that's a subset of the entirety of suggestions and rules and examples that are set forth in the Bible.
Let me answer though. I don't think I did that. I didn't say, here's how David acted, you should emulate him. Here's how Solomon acted, you should emulate him. I didn't say that. I said, here's what David did that was wrong, and so we should be careful we don't do that. Here's what Solomon did that was wrong, and this is the explanation of why he did it, and we shouldn't do that either. So I don't know which other, you know,
okay,
sometimes they did things that were right. So those are good things. So you learn how not to do those.
Okay, so let me frame. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Same point. I'm trying to get the same questions. Let me frame it. You use the Bible as providing helpful, useful evidence to help explain modern problems, right? I guess that's one way of putting it, right?
They're age-old problems. Human behavior.
Okay. I guess the trouble that I have, and that I'd like to ask you how you deal with it, is so for the examples you gave today, I think most of us can agree that makes great sense and whatnot. Maybe most people outside this room would agree. But there are a lot of things in the Bible that most people would reject out of hand. You know, behaviors that are held up as good or castigated as bad that the modern mind would completely reject.
I'm willing to take them all one at a time.
Okay, I guess what I'm trying.
I can't tell you saying that there are. I don't know if there are, but I'm willing to consider each one of them.
I'm saying there are some that are controversial today that people wouldn't look to for advice. There are certain subjects upon which the Bible.
If what they did was bad, then you learn not to do that. If what they did was good, then you learn to do it. So if you're going to say that some people would disagree as to a particular whether it was good or bad, okay. I mean, so they'll disagree. I mean, then they won't know which lesson to learn. But I'm saying there are a lot of good lessons.
I know that. No, I'm agreeing to a lot of good lessons. But I'm trying to figure out what's the screen for deciding what are the good lessons to present before the business community and the secular world? Like, how does one make that decision? Because
Well, if they're
how do you,
backed up by by the behavioral economic studies, so that, I mean, that's what I tried to do. I tried to show you that independent secular scientists conducted studies which corroborate this particular teaching. So that's what I would look for. I wouldn't
okay,
jump.
but then
and
why
say-
would you? But then why would you need the Bible? I'm not trying to be argumentative. I'm just curious. I'm trying.
If you see something you think you learn from, it's not because you're needing the Bible. I'm not saying you
No, I'm-
but if you look into the teachings, not just the Bible, the Talmud, the Mishnah, and so on, if you look and you find something that you think is interesting and you think you can discern something, so either you follow it or you try to design a test to test it. But you have to have a reason to design the test. So you can learn from these writings that this might be something I can learn. Let's test it. Let's ask Aurelio or his friends to design a test to see if it's true.
Thank you.
Bruce Baker, Seattle Pacific University. Steve, thanks very much. I appreciated the connections you drew between behavior and belief. So it sparks a thought for me about spiritual disciplines, and because the point you're making about we are becoming our actions, that makes a lot of sense. It's a profound statement, and it sparks a thought for me about spiritual disciplines, which is one way that some people have tried to pay attention to their actions and become virtuous and so on. I'm curious about it. Is there comes to mind is there any distinctive perspective that you bring on that from the Jewish faith?
I have to confess, I'm not exactly sure what you meant by spiritual discipline.
Okay, that might answer my question maybe. I don't know.
Oh, so but I can tell you, for example, just for example, there's so many different things to learn. I mentioned this thing about if you do something that's harsh, that it could change you to be cruel, if you do something cruel. So for example, if you have somebody in the office who's the hatchet man, or the hatchet woman, who does the firing, you monitor that person especially. Because they can become inured to what's at stake. Why? Because they're doing it, they don't want to be bad people, so they want to think it's justified, and they could be more likely to do it, to be harsher than they should be. So you have to, that's a lesson you get from this.